I'm Tony Ruiz of Gold Derby here with Stanley Nelson and Traci Curry, the directors of a brilliant new documentary called Attica, which looks at the prison riot of the same name. And Traci, I actually want to start with you because I've read that you knew very little about this subject going into it. So what was it like looking at this and examining this incident kind of as you're making a film about it?
Yeah, it was a complete education for me. Attica had happened before I was born, and I kind of had a vague sense that there had been a disturbance of some sort at a prison in New York in the 70s. I knew, like I think most people, the Dog Day Afternoon scene. Didn't really know what connection that had to any actual historic event, but I did understand that there was something that was so resonant about what happened that the mere invocation of that word is able to kind of evoke all of that emotion in that scene. And I knew that this had something to do with issues that I'm personally interested in, but I never could have imagined the extent of the story. I never could have imagined that this story ends with the state killing 39 of its own people. And it really was not only an education for me, but like a real journey in just kind of meeting and getting to know the people that were in the film. It was not easy for any of them to kind of revisit this, but just, I think one of the things that was so interesting to me is the thing that the men were crying out for 50 years ago, the recognition of their humanity, the way that kind of came out in the interviews. You really do see this whole spectrum of humanity, especially in the prisoners. You see their humor, you see their sadness, you see their rage, you see their shame, you see their indignation, you see this full spectrum in this group of people that we really don't get to kind of see that from. So I think in addition to just the education that I got about what happened at Attica, it also kind of opened up a window, I think, for empathy for me personally, just having to sort of sit with the stories and the humanity of these people who are men, who are older men, who are prisoners, who are men of color, that we often don't get to see that full spectrum of humanity from. So I think just in terms of the education, but also just kind of like, the becoming a more empathetic person to kind of sit with this. It really was a journey for me over the course of making the film.
And Stanley, you had some awareness of it going into it, but what was the greatest kind of thing that you took from your perspective, looking at this particular incident?
I think that I thought I knew a little bit about Attica. I really didn't know the nuts and bolts of it when we got into it. So I mean, I took so many things from what actually happened, from what's in the film, from the fact that the prisoners united in the yard and kind of set up their own little society, where they built trains and tents and elected leaders, to all the way to Richard Nixon's involvement, and Governor Rockefeller involvement. I talk a lot about the kind of casual racism that kind of permeates the story. The racist guards, and then when they retake the prison, they're yelling white power to Nixon and Rockefeller on the phone, talking about the blacks. Was it the blacks? So I think that it's a 2-hour film. It's a roller coaster ride. And, I just take so many different things. The exuberance of the first couple of days and the feeling from the prisoners and so many people involved that it would maybe actually, it could be negotiated to a peaceful settlement. And maybe there could actually be some change in the prison system from that to the disaster way that it ended.
One of the things that struck me particularly was the political undercurrent of this. And I think particularly the Rockefeller stuff, and I'll admit to being, really ignorant about, you hear the name Rockefeller and you kind of associate it with, New York Christmas time, things like, but you forget that there's an actual family name and actual people behind it. And the stunning kind of inhumanity that was the result of that. Did any of that catch you guys off guard? Because it sure caught me off guard.
Yeah, I mean, I'll let Tracy, talk about this a little bit more, but I think that just to give a little bit of background, Nelson Rockefeller was the governor of New York. He's one of, John D. Rockefeller's son, well, one of the richest men in the world. And he was always thought of as kind of the left wing, if such a thing exists, but the left wing of the Republican Party. And he wanted to be president. He had everything else. He was governor of the at that time the most populous state in the country. But he wanted to be president. And you see in the film that his political ambitions kind of take over and rule the day. Tracy?
Yeah, I think one of the things that was really striking to me is that, to a certain extent, this film is a story about injustices and racism at a systemic and institutional level. And sometimes when you tell stories about, or you try to kind of get your arms around what systemic and institutional racism looks like, it can be a tricky thing because it's hard to point to one thing and say that that's it. And so what's so interesting to me on that phone call that you hear with Rockefeller and with Nixon is that you hear them showing you how the sausage gets made. Like you hear them spinning this narrative that basically is about unruly and criminal Blackness to justify the state killing of 39 people. And of course, this is in this era of law and order. And in some ways on that call, what I hear is Nixon returning to the well, right? Because this idea that there is an unruly, disorderly Blackness in this country that needs to be controlled. And I am the one, if you elect me to fix it, it worked for him. He becomes president. You see the way he wields racism at the highest institution of power in this country. And he and Rockefeller are trying to go back to that same playbook, because of course, Rockefeller ultimately wants to become president of the United States. And so I think that was so striking to me to just kind of hear it, them saying the quiet part out loud on that call. And also the narrative that they were trying to create was so different from what we hear the prisoners saying, because for whatever differences and segregation they may have had while they were in Attica, when they were in D-Yard, it was very clear that they coalesced around a political identity that sort of transcended race and some of those divisions in some ways about being prisoners. But in order to justify what happened during the retaking, the story that Nixon and Rockefeller are telling together is a story about criminalized Blackness. And so that was, on some level, that's a thing that you kind of in the back of your head know that there's, guys in a smoky room having these conversations, but just to kind of hear it laid out like that was really kind of stunning.
Yeah, and I think also that as you're saying, it worked for Nixon, and it almost worked for Rockefeller. I mean, he came that close to being president. He was vice president, and so it worked for him. It didn't, for so many people, Rockefeller is still thought of as kind of, the slightly left wing of the Republican Party. And, the legacy of Attica, for most people, they don't think of Rockefeller in that way.
Yeah, the thing that struck me, there are so many moments in this film where I feel like you could hear those exact same words, you could hear the exact same conversations happening in 2020 and 2021. Was that something that came out of your research? That you saw those parallels, or did you see those parallels even going into this?
Tracy, you want to?
Yeah, I don't think that it was forefront of my mind going into it, just because we were so focused on telling this story about what happened in this moment. But it just so happens that we made this film in 2020, right? And so all of those parallels and that resonance was just there. You couldn't get away from it. And for me, it really crystallized for me what the story was that we were telling was about, which ultimately is about what happens when people make a just and righteous challenge to the power and authority and injustice of the state, the ways in which the state responds to reassert its power and the lengths to which it will go. I mean, I've always said that, I was in my little home pandemic box, as we all were last year. And I happened to live on a route in Brooklyn where protests happened. And so I saw George Floyd protests happening outside my window. I saw law enforcement descending on protesters outside my window. We all saw when the pandemic first happened, that people in prisons were pretty much left to get sick and die. No one cared about what happened to them. So all of that stuff just kind of bubbled up to the surface, and it was right there. And I don't think that and Stanley says a lot that, he's not, when he makes these films, he's not kind of trying to force you to see like this happened then and this is like that now. But I think you can't help, particularly in this moment that we find ourselves, but to see all of those parallels of what happened at Attica.
Yeah, I mean, I think that I knew going in that it would resonate today. We're not trying to make films that exist in some kind of historical bubble, and oh, that was great, or it was a nice film, let's go eat a hamburger. But something that really has some kind of resonance and relevance today. And we thought going in that the story of Attica did that. But that changed, as we were making the film with George Floyd and everything that happened, that it just became kind of more resonant and more relevant as we were making the film.
It stunned me in a way that I wasn't expecting, is the absolute commitment to showing these prisoners in their full humanity, which I think is something that the general public at large doesn't get to see, that these are still human beings. And I want to talk about those interviews because those interviews are so powerful and so beautiful and so haunting. What was the process of building that relationship with these men and getting them to tell their stories?
Yeah, I mean, I should say, that Traci did all the interviews, and so I'll let her talk about, that. But I think that before we talk about that, I think we have to talk about the fact that everything was done during the time of COVID, and so that I think it was March when COVID really struck hard. We were supposed to start shooting in April. I was like, oh God, what do we do? And we paused. And I think technically we wanted the interviews to look like, pre-COVID, or post-COVID. We didn't want people wearing masks. We didn't want them sitting outside in coats and scarves and hats. And we didn't want to send them, we didn't want to have a Zoom interview, and so we really worked to not do that. But Traci can talk about the interviews, which I think are just incredible, and they say so much, and not only the words but the faces, that everything about the interviews I think really works.
Yeah, I mean, as you can imagine, having to revisit the defining trauma of your life to a complete stranger is not something that most people are jumping to do. And that was no exception in this case. I mean, there certainly were people that hung up on me and were angry that I was asking. But fortunately, there were enough people who were really gracious enough to share these parts of their lives with us. And I really just tried to be as transparent as I could with them about what Stanley and my intentions were for their stories and for the film. I tried to go into an understanding that this was a trauma. I tried to go into an understanding that, there is a distance in many ways between me and these men. I am a woman, I am younger than them, I have never been incarcerated. And so I just tried to really hold space for the kind of humanity that we both share, and the fact that I just wanted to kind of hear what their experience was without judgment. And there were, conversations over the course of the months before we finally sat down on camera. But I will also say that, a lot of people have asked, oh, well, what did you say, or what did you do to kind of get that, what you see on the screen? And in some ways we just lucked up, because that's just the way those guys came to us. That's just who they are, that humanity, that kind of compelling way that they recount what happened to them. And I think to some extent, memories that are attached to some sort of very intense emotional experience tend to be very resonant in that way in your head. But the way that they were able to access not only the memories of what exactly happened to them, but those emotions as though they were still living it today. And honestly, some of them still are. The 9th through the 13th of September is very triggering every year for some of them. But that's just kind of who they were. And so once they kind of, I think, felt comfortable, by the time we sat down on camera, they were able to just kind of put it all out there. And I think that shows in what you end up seeing in the film.
I also think that the including, did you have equal difficulty or problems, getting the families of the guards as well? What was that conversation like?
Yeah, so same thing, kind of going into it, realizing that there were those distances. I think I had to sort of do a little extra work because, there is a lot of distrust on the part of the families about the media, the way the story has been handled over the years. And so it really was the same. I tried to be as transparent with them. I tried to recognize that there were, these gaps between me and them coming to them. There were certainly some political things that they brought up, but ultimately I did the same thing. I let them know this is our intention. We want to tell a 360-degree story that does not villainize you or the people of Attica. In fact, we're interested in knowing more about Attica as a place and as a community and not just a prison. As this story has been told, a lot of them told me that after everything happened, it was almost like they wore, like the letter A was their scarlet letter, that like their kids, when they would go play sports against other teams, they wouldn't wear their Letterman jacket because they would go other places, and Attica meant this whole other thing, right? So I kind of let them know in the same way that I did the prisoners that we're just trying to recognize your humanity here, that this is something that they were victims of the state as well, and that we really want to hear what happened to you. Unfortunately, they trusted us enough to share with us.
The film has been so well received, and you've got the Critics' Choice nominations, which is a really big boost to the film. I'm just wondering, what's been like the most profound kind of response that you've gotten from the film so far?
Stunned silence. That's what we get, and you got to get used to it. We premiered at Toronto, and that was it, and that's pretty much been the reaction, over and over again. The one thing that I loved, we had a screening for Doc NYC the other day, and it was packed. And when Big Black comes out at the end, and he's alive, they started cheering. They started cheering, and so that was really unexpected. And even at other screenings, you can hear the breath drawn in from people when Big Black comes out, because it's almost like it's the one good thing to hold on to, in the film.
Yeah, I'll agree. I think all of it has been interesting to me just because, Stanley and I have lived with this thing from almost 2 years. And for a lot of that time, it was just like a tiny thing in my laptop in my tiny apartment while I was alone. So now that it's kind of out in the world and people are seeing it, and I forget how many people were like me, they don't know this story. So all of it is shocking to me, shocking to them. So it has been interesting to see all of the audience's reactions to the story and the shock of, in some ways it will never not be shocking to understand that 39 people were killed by the state. But I just kind of know that on a visceral level now. And so for it to be a new thing and that new surprise and that new shock and that new disgust to see audiences have, and also the reaction of the people that are in the film that have seen it so far has been really nice, because they, for the most part, have let us know that they feel like we got it right. And so just for me having made this promise to them about what we were going to do with these slices of their lives, and how we were going to use the interviews, if they feel like that was a promise kept, that's nice to know from them.
Well, both of you, congratulations. It's such a stunning and haunting and really actually beautiful film. Everybody go to goldderby.com, make your predictions for the Oscars, and stay tuned for interviews with more contenders throughout the season. Traci Curry, Stanley Nelson, congratulations. Thank you so much.
Thank you.